Okay, good to go. Good to go. Thank you and welcome to everyone that's here and that is listening to this Juneteenth podcast. It is the 2022 official Juneteenth of New Bern podcast that we always kick off our Juneteenth week and let our community know exactly what we're doing, what we're involved in, what this year's Juneteenth theme is about, and why it is so very important that we edify our audience on all things Juneteenth and the social impact that it has and the things that are going on around the state. It's so very important that we stay connected and show that we have interconnectivity, not just through North Carolina, but even throughout the country. And that support is imperative to the work that we do. So without further ado, I will definitely introduce our one-of-a-kind guest who so graciously gave us some time today to be able to speak with him and receive some gems and some knowledge about the next generation of what's going on in our social justice movements. And that is none other than Mr. William Barber Jr. How are you?
Doing well, Talina, doing well. So good to see you. Will, just a quick adjustment. I'm the third, my father's the second.
I'm so sorry.
No worries. Yeah, we everyone always gets us confused because we do a little interesting thing in my family. We don't do juniors. William Barber, the senior, my grandfather, he said he wanted to have the second and the third because he believed that allowed us to step within the legacy, but also have the uniqueness. So he did that. So just a little personal history. Yeah.
Of course. And I will ensure to make sure that is not forgotten or anything when we put this out there, because I am very, I'm very respectful of people's titles and their stories, and that is your name, and that is important. And I'm sitting here reading through all of this information about you and didn't even realize that I didn't catch that. So again, I appreciate you letting me know what that meant to you and your family. So thank you.
No, absolutely.
Of course.
Absolutely, yeah.
So this is, again, just a little backdrop. We do a Juneteenth podcast every Monday to kick off our week. And this year, we were able and blessed to have a young man by the name of Isaiah Daniels, who also donated his time and his talent to our Juneteenth celebration, and is a good friend of mine, is a very good friend of mine. And I know after speaking to you in preparation for this podcast, he's a good friend of yours as well. And He just so happens to be on the line and listening. But I'd like to send a shout out to him and thank him for the opportunity to allow us to connect.
Shout out to Brother Isaiah. He and I have been in many a foxhole together. So I'm going to shout you out, brother, on this podcast. Good brother, heart for the people, heart for the community. As you said, Talina, one of the most genuine people out there. So Shout out to you.
Perfect. And Isaiah, you can say hello if you want to. That's fine. We know you're in the audience listening. So again, I thank you.
Well, thank you. I'm glad to be a part of this great occasion and just to hear what's being said.
Awesome. I know I'm in good company. Definitely. So with that being said, Mr. Barber III, would you mind giving us a little bit of background just on how did you get started in such an active role in our communities?
Yeah, no, that's a good question, Talina. And, if it's not obvious, social justice and community activism was not a foreign thing in my upbringing. With my father being Bishop William J Barber II, formerly of the North Carolina NAACP, now the Poor People's Campaign, and repairs of the breach, as well as my mother, who I want to shout out, Rebecca McLean Barber, who has been extremely supportive and no less active, no less committed to the fight for social justice They really instilled in myself and the upbringing of my siblings, my brothers and sisters, this sentiment of history, being a student of history, but also being committed to social justice, committed to serving your community. So at an early age, I grew up seeing both of them engaged in struggles, everything from local education and making sure there was quality education for schools in the inner city where I was growing up in Goldsboro, to other social justice issues, including access to the right to vote, including protecting public education, including challenging the discriminate impacts of the death penalty here in North Carolina. So at an early age, I was just privy to a number of issues. And of course, some of that, I took on. And I always wrestled with, what would be my particular niche? What would be my particular contribution, to this work, which I think is important for every leader to think about and to wrestle with. And so what I landed on was this unique intersection, and we'll talk about it a little more, but of what I call the three crises of our time today: poverty, democracy, and the crisis of our climate. I focus in particular on the climate and environmental crisis. I have a background in environmental physics as well as environmental law and policy, but believe that all three of those issues form a unique set of challenges that our generation face. So I come to this work with a deep familial legacy, with the legacy of about a decade of my own in terms of social justice organizing around a number of those issues, including in the North Carolina NAACP and the Youth and College Division, where Brother Isaiah and our paths crossed many years ago, unfortunately, to tell a little bit on ourselves about age, but have since, taken those experiences and continued my contribution to this work. Yeah.
And a great contribution it has been. Thank you for that background. Indeed, I don't think a lot of folks who do this work with me here in New Bern completely understand the totality of what you have going on as far as climate justice and things like that. So I appreciate you educating us on that part. I typically will ask even the students that I mentor or people that I talk to, where have you been? What are you doing? And where are you going? So I pose the same question to you, as you have just told us the steps that you've taken to get to where you are today and the amazing people that impacted you to get there, including your mother. So what are you doing?
So what am I doing? That's a good question. What am I doing? As I mentioned, my particular niche of work focuses on the climate and environmental crisis, kind of as the core issue. There, a lot of people are not necessarily privy to some of the impacts of climate change, especially when we talk about frontline communities, low-income communities, poor communities, rural communities, and communities of color. There's a particular impact when we talk about the climate crisis, where the greatest physical effects, when we talk about extreme weather, displacement that happens from extreme weather events and disasters like flooding. I'm sure New Bern has experienced flooding, in recent years connected to some of the hurricanes. When we talk about energy burden and high utility bills, where people who often live in homes that are older, that have not been properly weatherized, which usually are predominantly in our communities, in Black communities. They see high percents of their checks going to just maintaining their energy bills. When we talk about the effects on things that we know, like food deserts, for example, the inability to access healthy food in poor communities, in Black communities, in communities in rural places, how that is made worse by issues like climate change, notwithstanding public health concerns. When we talk about coming out of a pandemic like a COVID-19, where we saw attack the respiratory system, but also disproportionately impacted communities on the front lines. Again, Black, brown, poor communities that have had a history of being exposed disproportionately to pollution when we add in the layer of environmental injustice. So my work, to distill it down, is looking at how the climate crisis makes worse those issues of social disparity that we have perfected. And I always say that we have perfected as a society because those fallouts that I just named have too often been the result of intentional, bad, discriminatory policy decisions. And so when we think about communities that are facing these issues, I always say that, we have to know the history of how those issues came about. And to the communities themselves, I say, never see you all as like victims or see this is just happenstance, like this is just what to be expected. It's been intentional bad policy decisions that have victimized communities by locking them into these realities and make it harder for people who are existing in those areas. And so I look at that work, and think on one hand about the problem, like I said, how climate change serves as a multiplier on those issues, but then about the solution, how when we think about the critical mass of consciousness that's coming together to solve the climate crisis, we have an unprecedented amount of capital, unprecedented amount of collective thought that is being applied to deploy climate solutions. But we also have to see how that is an opportunity to deploy climate solutions that advance racial equity, that advance systemic poverty, and that undergird communities on the front lines in rural Eastern areas to be included when we talk about that just transition to a clean economy. So that's my work.
Indeed, brother. I see a lot of places where I definitely look forward to learning more about the initiatives that you are all doing and connecting, because if you didn't just speak to some of the issues, the very issues that we face here in New Bern, North Carolina, especially after Hurricane Florence, and no more evident than in the resiliency of certain neighborhoods, the resiliency of certain communities, I hate to keep harping on it, the access to resources for those communities after there is a terrible tragedy. And, Isaiah and Ms. Sharon Bryant, who's here as well, can attest to how, those marginalized communities came together and utilized whatever resources they had to be able to pull each other up, or at least to a place of livability. And we have a lot of work to do here as far as the resiliency planning, the quality of housing that is here in this area. So again, you're speaking to the choir when you're speaking, and I love the fact that you are in this with us. And I can't wait to see, what more information after just this small appetizer that we are giving people just for, this event, but what more there is to be done after this and how we can all connect, because I think that you are speaking something powerful. You definitely are.
Well, I appreciate it, Talina. And, we don't have to rush through. I know we had a time marker, but, this work is so critical. And I tend to be, I alluded to something earlier. I'm going to try to talk in some specifics, but I alluded to this notion of being a student of history. That was instilled in me early on as a child. And I think Isaiah and others, our good friend Tyler Swanson, shout out to him, came to understand the importance as we are thinking about our present need for leadership, for solutions, for action. You have to be a student of history. You have to understand how we, and I say we collectively, as a nation, as communities, as people, got to this point, and you have to look back as you are plotting the future forward. In 1967, Dr. King first articulated this idea of a fierce urgency of now. And he said there that there was this idea that there's actually such a thing as being too late. And that wasn't a framework for despairing. It was actually a framework where he was urging the nation to recognize that it was no time for apathy or complacency, but instead was a time for vigorous and positive action. So that was in 1967, when he basically was sounding the alarm, he and the movement and the many choir of other activists and advocates who were standing with him, because it wasn't just King. But in 1967, they were raising the awareness around the triple ills that they called of poverty, militarism, and systemic racism. 50 years later, those words ring true with renewed vigor, our own fierce urgency of now. You know, right now, 140 million people, Americans in this country alone, are living under the crushing burden of poverty. They're either poor or one life emergency from being poor. And that was before COVID-19. And these aren't people who are not working. These are working people, sometimes 2-3 jobs. Before the pandemic of COVID-19, there were 700 people who were dying every day. Despite growing health costs where tens of millions of people were not able to get treatment. There were 87 million people uninsured every day before COVID-19. So 16.2 million people who lost their employer provided insurance before COVID-19.
Right.
And so we're still reeling from that impact. But when a nation has 140 million poor, nearly half, almost over 46% of its populace who are poor or one emergency from being poor, you cannot sustain as a society. It's impossible. And then, like I said, we connect it to the crisis of climate, crisis of poverty, crisis of democracy. We got to recognize that there is no reality where we get to bold policy action on any issue, on climate, on poverty, on dismantling a system of white supremacy, on access to the right to vote, without having robust participation in our free elections. So,
oh man, you hit a nerve right there. And this is again the point where I do have a sister in advocacy here. Her name is Jamisha Harris. She is Alderwoman Harris here in the city of New Bern, youngest elected alderwoman, and who is fighting the good fight into making her, her tagline was making politics relatable, just so that the average everyday person understands that we call it the so what factor. So what does that have to do with me? So what does having organized elections or those types of things, why are they so important? Why is it important for me to know my history? Again, if you don't know how to effectively weaponize your vote or your the things that you have been through and utilize that experience, or the things that your parents have been through and utilize that to energize you to move forward and progress, then you're lost in a sense. And we know how so very important the collective is. I mean, again, we can sit here and educate ourselves all day, but we also understand that we have to connect together and organize in order to make lasting, impactful change. And she's all fired up right now because we just had our local elections, and less than 10% of the people in her district voted. And then wonder why we have some of the results that we have, or don't have results that we want. And she understands that we don't have affordable housing necessarily because there are things that have happened and votes that didn't take place that needed to have, or we needed to have a representative up there that was speaking the truth about equity and diversity and inclusion and all of those things that make everyone's quality of life better, not just the few. So, I wish she was here so you could see how fired up she was. But again, with this network that we have of us younger professionals out here trying to move the needle, I have no doubt that we're all going to connect and be able to do some amazing things. And I can feel your passion for history and your passion for our climate and your passion for impoverished people. I'm there with you. And I can't say that enough. You have a partner here in Eastern North Carolina who was willing to do the work to make it so. And let Jamisha tell us she wants to be, not wants to be, but it's like fired up like the Stacey Abrams of Eastern North Carolina. So again, you got a powerful battery down here waiting to be energized. And I always tell people, we're a good weapon here. Just point us and shoot. And we'll take care of the rest for you. So, and with people like Isaiah on our team, people that live and walk in integrity, I am happy for the people of Eastern North Carolina that we have people such as yourself and Isaiah at the helm doing this work. So again, I can't thank you enough. I'm gonna keep thank you every time I see you, because you could have done anything, but I don't think with the family you have, you could have really done anything. But
it was bound to happen somewhere.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But I think, again, it's great to have a partner like you in this line of work, and I feel as though we can all learn so much from each other.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I mean, what you said, really struck a chord to me when we talk about our collective power, like the batteries that you mentioned, having that cohort of a small but powerful, committed, group of folks. That's in countries and communities all across the Southeast, all across the nation. And what we really have to do, and as we talk a little bit about the Poor People's Campaign, is see a coming together of that collective power so that we actually can wield and build it towards solutions that are beneficial, directly beneficial to communities, too often on the front lines. And we see that it's a strange phenomenon that sometimes our opposition, and when I say opposition, I say anyone who is looking to impede access to the right for self-determination, access to the right to vote for communities, just communities.
Right.
And when we see attacks on the democracy, it's a strange phenomenon where sometimes our opposition recognizes the potential power we have more so than we do. And we have to remind ourselves that when we see how vigorous the attacks are that are hammering at attempts to steal the right to vote, that are hammering at attempts to deny and discourage young people for standing up and voting on their issues. When we see that, it's because the opposition recognizes if we get on the same page, if we get in step, if we truly participate in this beautiful experiment called the American democracy, we can shake up the world. Like, recognize, and I say all to all the folks, young folks, my peers even. So like, what does it matter? Why should we vote? 2020 was the first election cycle where the potential pool of millennial voters outnumbered the potential pool of baby boomers. It was literally a changing of the political guard. Mm-hmm. Just in terms of raw numbers. In terms of participation, that's a different story. But in terms of what the potential is there, right now, millennials who are unregistered but potential eligible voters outnumber, for the first time in history, those that were baby boomers and have typically, wielded the seats of power. And so when we see attacks on voting rights, when we see attacks to gerrymander our electoral districts, we see attacks to hijack the judiciary, we know that's a direct response to that reality of the potential power that exists at the grassroots within these communities. Recognize 2016 was the first presidential election in 50 years without the full protection of the Voting Rights Act. Not going to call any names, but did anything strange happen in 2016? Did we have any consequential presidential election in 2016?
You don't say.
It was the first presidential election in 50 years without the full protection of the Voting Rights Act. And that was made possible only by a 5-4 decision by the Supreme Court in 2013 to gut Section 5 of the VRA. And so when we talk about what does our vote, how does it have consequences? One, the presidential election. Two, who is nominated to the Supreme Court by the president. Three, the future ramifications when we talk about access to the right to vote for our folks. And so I know we're coming up on time, but I just wanted to say that as we kind of connect some of these dots.
Brother, you are right on target. Whether you know it or not, you are right on time, because again, we just went through our municipal elections. And if there was not ever a time before of how evident our vote wasn't, how important it was, and how a lot of people attempted to manipulate our elections and our vote. We saw it. We just saw it locally. So that is so very important. And I think what's important as well to get out to other young folks is knowing the value of your stock, knowing that even if it's not a presidential election and it's just your local school board, is so very important, because there wouldn't be so many people trying to stop you from utilizing it if it wasn't. And that's that so what factor. And we'll talk more about this, down the line, especially, but we can't say it enough. It's very important that young folks understand the value of your stock, and your stock includes your vote, not just, and we also tell them, the taxes that you pay, the things that you choose to be a consumer on, everything. Right. Even when you're an entrepreneur and you're paying your taxes, your business taxes and everything, you have to understand the value of your stock. Mm-hmm. And it's so important, and it's being almost trying to be manipulated every day. So that's so very important. And again, I'm not going to go too far into the weeds, because I know that based on our prior conversations, we definitely can keep going on with that, because we're passionate about this subject in particular. But I really wanted to hone back in on that collective. That collective that we talk about is so important, that makes movements such as the Poor People's Campaign that fuel those type of movements when we come together and we utilize the strengths, the time and talent that we have in an effective manner. I only preface that with our Juneteenth celebration and trying to connect the dots with folks on why did we decide to have this conversation for our podcast. Well, as Ms. Sharon can attest to, when we first started this thing, it was a day. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. It was one day of trying to convince people that this history was important to share. Mm-hmm. And from that was 5 years ago. And from that, as you can see, just slowly educating people and talking to folks and connecting and building a collective. We're to a 10-day celebration that spans this area, uptown, downtown, and every generation has something that they can enjoy about Juneteenth and really about each other. That's really what it's about, being able to celebrate and recognize each other's individual strengths, and how that weaves together a beautiful quilt and story to tell. Mm-hmm. And I have some Juneteenth organizers who were helping us last year who called and told me, Miss Talina, we'd love to be there, but we got the Poor People's Campaign this weekend. And that was perfect. I was so happy to see that, because, we are also people who have, my group of friends and people around us have gone many years to HK on J. Mm-hmm. And, are very familiar with the Poor People's Campaign, the Moral March. Again, myself, I'm an executive officer in our local NAACP branch. So, of course, Poor People's Campaign is not unfamiliar to me whatsoever. And I want to say this fully. I am expecting all of our Juneteenth participants to support the movement and what you have going on. But further, can you just explain a little bit about, what we were talking about before, how that ties into the Poor People's Campaign and its mission, and then why it was so significant to have this Moral March in Washington, D.C. on June 18th?
Yeah, no, absolutely. We talked a little bit at the top about this notion of history. So in 1968, Dr. Martin Luther King and others called for what they said a revolution of values in America. They sought to build a broad fusion movement that could unite, talking about that collective power, that could unite not just Black communities, but poor and impacted communities across the country. And they were challenging, again, at their time, the three ills, what they saw of poverty, of systemic racism, and of rampant militarism that they said would lead to social death for America if it did not hit the brakes and think about a new, different way of doing things. And they came up with a direct cry from the underside of history, this being the Poor People's Campaign. Today, the Poor People's Campaign, a national call for moral revival, with my father, Bishop William J Barber II of Repairs of the Breach, and Reverend Dr. Liz Theo Harris of the Cairo Center, shout out to her, serving as co-chairs, who are picking up that unfinished work. And they are now confronting the interlocking evils of the poverty, the rampant militarism, the systemic racism, but also recognizing the crises of our times, ecological devastation. Also, the distorted moral narrative of religious nationalism, which seeks to distill our morals to an asinine, really echo chamber of faith, instead of really a call to how do we relate to our fellow man. And so recognizing that the nation at this point is at a critical juncture. Again, 140 million poor people in the United States alone. That's a critical juncture. So we need a movement that will shift the moral narrative, impact policies, and elections at every level of government to watch this, build lasting power for poor and impacted people, recognizing when we lift from the bottom, the entire society rises. Mm-hmm. And so that is what the call to action is happening on June 18th, 2022, where there's going to be a mass poor people's assembly and moral march on Washington, which is not the end of the movement. It is really just the next stage where poor people will come together from all across the nation, standing together in solidarity, an invisible image of solidarity, saying they were going to go to work, take this movement back to their communities, and also begin to build power towards the election and ballot box to make sure that we get the policy change that is so desperately needed. So that is what is going on. And that is directly connected to what you all are doing, you know, with the Juneteenth event, because you're building critical infrastructure, building power at the grassroots, at those areas of impact. And so for those individuals who cannot be there in person, we know that you all will be there in spirit. If you go to poorpeoplescampaign.org, you can find the live stream sessions, so you can participate that way virtually and can be on the lookout. As I said, you know, June 18th is simply the beginning. So after that event, you know, there will be plenty of opportunities to connect with the North Carolina Poor People's Campaign, of which I'm a part, and we'll be in touch, Talina, to see how we can collaborate and do some things. But there will be plenty of opportunities to continue to join together, to build together, and to grow the movement as we try to push the nation in a more just, more equitable society for all of us.
Amazing. Thank you for that. And thank you for letting everyone know how to find more information about what you have going on. Again, like I said, you have plenty of supporters here in Eastern North Carolina and beyond. And I guess my last question that I wrap it up with this would be, because you've given me so much and you've given everyone else so much to chew on and to try to figure out maybe which direction they should go in trying to be impactful and how to do that. My question would be to the young individual, rural North Carolinian who fears the next hurricane or flood, or who lives near a hog farm and fears the repercussions of that, to the inner city youth in places like where I come from, Buffalo, New York, who fear going to the grocery store or what someone might say to them, a police officer might say to them on the street because of the color of their skin, or because they may not have the funds to be as impactful as they would like in their communities. And to the young person who's trying to figure their way and how do I help in this social justice movement? I see so much going on around me and in the world. It's a lot. And where do I start? Mm-hmm. What would you say to them? Because at the end of the day, we're all going through these individual things in small pockets. We're all having some of the same conversations. Mm-hmm. How do we, what message do we give to all these young folks on how to connect and to become a useful tool in the toolbox of justice and equity and equality?
Yeah. No, it's a great question. You know, I would first say where to start. You know, we got to start with girding ourselves, you know, and there's a quote that I often reflect on deeply by one of my heroes, Frederick Douglass, who was in literally the challenge of, you know, challenging the vestiges of slavery, which seemed insurmountable at the time, seemed like it was fully entrenched, just nowhere to go. And in the face of that, he said that oppression organized as ours is would appear invincible up to the very hour of its fall. So let us look at the other side and see if there are not some things to cheer our heart and nerve us up anew. And I say that because when talking to young folks who are facing incredible crises, some that none of us have faced up to this point, still recognizing that hope in of itself is an act of resistance. And so to never lose that. Secondly, I would say, it is important to gird yourself, but then connect with others of like mind. And I would encourage them to recognize that there is an enormous variety and wealth of expertise and experience in those communities where you sit. You just have to find it. And we have to tap into in this urgent moment of solving our social crises. Again, we have to dispel the narrative of victimhood for communities and instead see our communities as crucibles of history, crucibles of innovation, crucibles of solution. We also have to think that while those communities, frontline, BIPOC, and poor communities have systemically experienced some of the worst degradation in our society, we gotta acknowledge, again, that is a function not of just what is destined, it's a function of a flawed system that has imposed unjust policy, not a function of who they are or a lack of vision. So it is imperative that we see these communities not just as impacted areas, but as co-creators that have power at the grassroots that can help build a future for us all. Additionally, I would encourage folks to think that when we talk about our issues, we have to think holistically about how the issues of poverty, of racial disparity, of gender inequity, of environmental crisis intersect. We're at a moment in society where you cannot simply analyze one issue. You might focus your body of work on one issue, but you have to be broadly aware of how your issue of passion, your body of work intersects with other issues, because how do our communities experience them? All at once. So those are some of the points of advice I would suggest. Yeah.
Amazing. And I guess if I had any saved round, I would ask, what medium would you recommend young folks absorb in order to edify themselves or teach themselves on more about history and the importance of the work that we're doing?
A couple of books. I would start with a good one that I've been telling folks right now is The Color of Law by Richard Rothstein. Take a look at The Color of Law by Richard Rothstein. I think that's a powerful testimony in terms of some of the economics of how we've seen disparity in this country. I would also say look into, especially for folks in Eastern North Carolina, there's a book called We Have Taken a City that talks about the Wilmington race riot of 1898. Isaiah knows what I'm talking about. And it talks about how when we've seen this coming together, these fusion coalitions beginning to creep up, it's not that they failed, they were intentionally and violently undercut. And so that is even more impetus that we have to continue to build. But those two areas is what I would suggest. Yeah.
Perfect. Again, the word thank you comes to mind graciously for allowing us a little bit of your time and gems of your talent, so that we can be able to utilize those to spread the message. And we will be watching from afar, those of us who will be here, but supporting, no doubt, as strongly as ever, the initiatives that you have going on. And the Moral March that is happening on June 18th. We will be playing it live at our event so that people can still feel connected and engaged from Eastern North Carolina. And I believe that is it. That is that. I wish I could glean more, but I want to give people time to let what we said sink in.
Yeah.
And I'll give them the links and things to how to get in touch with the Poor People's Campaign, and to continue to watch for the initiatives that you all have going on, especially in the North Carolina Poor People's Campaign. So is there anything that left that you want to say before we tell everyone good night?
Yeah, just a shout out again to all the work that you all are doing again, in the state and our community. Shout out to holding down the 252. We'll definitely continue to be in touch, continuing to identify opportunities to build, and we will talk soon. Thank you so much, everyone.
Looking forward to it. You have an amazing evening.
Take care. All right.
Bye-bye.